Welcome to another episode of Corporate CPR, where we breathe life back into your organization, projects, and processes, giving you insights to recovery and avoiding corporate mortality events. Today, we'll be talking about how not having a strong business continuity plan might kill your company. And joining us to contribute to the conversation is Patrick Hardy. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. Can you share with our audience a little bit about your background?
Yeah, I've been involved in almost every element of disaster preparedness imaginable. So I started my career, oddly enough, as a lifeguard. So that was my first sort of emergency responder job. And from there, I became an EMT. From there, I became a medic. And then I graduated college. And then Hurricane Katrina struck Louisiana. And so I moved directly to Louisiana. I worked under the governor. Doing emergency preparedness and response work. Then I moved over to the Attorney General's office, helping with Homeland Security issues. Then I went overseas and I studied emergency management in Great Britain. And so I wanted to learn the contrast between how we do emergency preparedness here in the United States versus how they do it in Europe. And then when I finished my master's degrees there, I came back and opened a business. And so I work with small businesses from coast to coast. So I work with restaurants and bars and nursing homes and charter schools and beekeeping operations and underwater cable operations, all kinds of fascinating businesses. And in business continuity, I was my career trajectory is a little bit different than most who get into this industry because my father was a business continuity professional. And my grandfather was also involved in, it wasn't called business continuity then, it was called civil contingencies when he was attached to the Army. But it was essentially the same concept of ensuring sort of continuity of operations and processes. And so now I work with Fortune 500 companies. I'm an external consultant, and I just recently I became a content creator. So now I have a brand new YouTube channel, which is going live in about a week or two. And I am going to be posting videos of all kinds about disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. And as we go through this interview today, I'll talk to you a little bit more about what that means and my general approach towards emergency response.
Oh, excellent. So I know disaster recovery is important because a lot of, even for insurance, they want to know whether or not you have a disaster recovery plan. And so maybe it might be good just defining what we mean right there with business continuity and disaster recovery, and what is the extent. I mean, I'm sure most people know, but always like to start with a good definition.
Yeah, absolutely. In 1995, the Disaster Recovery Institute conducted a fascinating study. It was seminal, landmark, and it was really eye-opening for a lot of people because they decided to study all the businesses that were directly impacted by the 1993 World Trade Center bombings. And I'm not referring to 9/11. I'm referring to when Al Qaeda actually placed a truck bomb and placed it underneath the building in the hopes that the World Trade Center would actually topple onto other buildings like dominoes. And so they decided to examine all the companies that had been impacted by that bombing, and they studied them. And so starting in 95, they began to study them, and they followed them for about 5 years until 1998. And then they published their study, and they discovered something interesting. 80%, 80% of the companies that were not recovered in 2 weeks went out of business within 5 years. And that was not correlative with whether or not they were a part of a subsidiary of a larger business, or whether they were a small company, or whether they were well capitalized or not. All of those factors considering, even in those instances within 5 years, 80% of those businesses had closed. Because one of the things that we've discovered over time is that if businesses don't begin to recover right away, so we don't start recovering our processes to ensure that we can become profitable very rapidly, and then we ensure that we have our people available and in place, then we simply will never recover. It is a mortality event of epic proportions. Now, if we look at things like if major events, Hurricanes Katrina, Sandy, the Camp Fire, which occurred out in California, which was the August, and we had the August Complex Fire, which was which was what we call a gig fire, meaning it covered 1 million contiguous acres of burning. Those businesses as well are also going out of business because many of them, even though they got capitalized at some point, if they didn't have their processes together, if they weren't able to ensure that the actual business units were able to recover quickly enough, they discovered that they were unable to get back to profitability in the long run.
So can you, I obviously haven't seen this study and stuff, but can you tell me more about that? Like, if is it a matter of not having enough um, funds to see it through? Like, why does that timeline have such an impact on your ability to stay in business?
Yeah, if it were just a sense of money, then the wealthiest companies would have obviously survived without a problem, right? But one of the
Right?
things that we found, and one of the reasons why business continuity is so critical for every business, I talk about this with small businesses of all kinds, is if you don't have an ability to recover, then what happens is that the critical people, the human resources involved, simply will leave the company. And when they leave, you lose institutional knowledge, you lose people, you lose all their professionalism, you lose all the benefit that you get from them on a daily basis. Because a lot of times what happens is sometimes I think companies forget when they don't write business continuity plans, they forget that they are the lifeline for the employees. They rely on those paychecks. When they don't
For
receive them,
sure.
people will leave. I actually had a company I worked with in Louisiana once. They were a graphics design company, and they had a massive hurricane come through. And right after the hurricane, they sent the manager of the company sent out a message to all the employees saying, "I need you back here. You need to be back on such and such date. If you're not here, you're in trouble." So that date came and went, and many of the employees showed up. About 90% of them showed up, and about 10% didn't show up at all. And the person kept texting and texting, saying, you need to come back. And this was about a month after the hurricane had happened. And one of the employees uh, didn't receive the text in time, and that employee was terminated. Was terminated for cause, meaning they could never come back to the company ever again. And one day, the employee, realizing they hadn't heard anything from their boss, actually showed up at the office about 2 months after the hurricane, 2 months later, and said, "I thought I was supposed to wait to hear from you." And she said, "I've been texting and calling you. I've been texting and calling
Mhm.
everybody. Where have you been?" And the employee said, "I live on a farm in the middle of nowhere. I have no cell phone reception whatsoever. There was no way for me to get your message." So that creates those kinds of quagmires when companies don't adequately prepare. And when I say prepare, a lot of times companies think, well, I'm going to go hire a consultant. I'm going to go write this I'm going to go, write this massive plan. We're going to put it in a beautiful binder. And then lo and behold, everything is going to work out well. Well, what many people
Mm,
forget is that one of the critical elements to business continuity is communication with employees, because your employees are your most valuable assets.
mm,
They're more valuable than your IP. They're more valuable than your technology. They're more valuable than anything else you have in your company. And when they don't come back or when they leave, then you start to see the company begin to atrophy very, very slowly because you suddenly have people who aren't coming back. And so the 1998 study, which studied the terrorist attack, came to roughly the same kinds of same kind of conclusions, that essentially, if you don't have people who are able to come back, the institution simply can't recover in time. You can't get your business units working in time for you to become profitable, and that's when you start to
well,
lose the company itself.
did they find any difference? And I don't know, 1998 might be too long ago in the sense
Mhm,
of the like how our infrastructure is today, but I'm just
mhm.
wondering, is there a difference in white collar companies, or companies that are or maybe more B2B, and maybe they can, people they don't have to have a physical building or something versus, your
Mhm.
coffee shop or something where you have to be there and show up. I mean, were there any differences there?
Well, I don't know enough about the study. I can't quote that in
Mm,
that kind of detail. But what I will
okay.
tell you is that one of the things I tell people today is I talk about the pandemic all the time.
Yeah.
which is I know people who worked for companies, and I'm sure we can all, we can all think of people who had this sort of situation where they were in the pandemic, they were at home because they were instructed by their offices to stay home, whether or not they were a coffee shop or whether or not they were a graphics design company or they were an insurance company, whatever, they were all told to stay home. Many
Mm,
people didn't know if they were actually going to ever return to the office ever again. Many people
right.
didn't realize if they were actually going to get a paycheck again. They didn't know if the company was going to reopen again. I write about this in my book too. I say, one of the things I don't understand is I don't understand how companies simply don't want to do basic communication with employees regarding the business continuity plan. There is a plank. There are 10 things that employees at a minimum, need to know about your business continuity plan. And I know a lot of companies that take their business continuity plan and they lock them away. I've actually seen them before. I used to be a consultant with big pharmaceutical companies, and
Mm,
literally the business continuity plan required two keys. Two people in two different departments had to get into a locked safe. That was the only way to get to them. And I asked them why, and they said, well, these things expose, passwords and phone numbers and everything. And I said, that's fine. But what I would do is, and I used to do this randomly, especially in these large buildings, they were really fun. I'd walk up to random employees and say, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about the business continuity plan. Can you tell me about this? Can you tell me about this? Can you tell me about this? And universally, I would hear from employees, I have no idea. In fact, I've actually run into employees who said, I don't even know what a business continuity plan is. They didn't realize they even
mm.
had one. And they didn't realize that there are laws, particularly with certain types of public companies, that you must have a recovery plan. You must have business continuity in place, financial businesses as well. And I've spoken to people as well who said they had no idea. And that tells me that employees are now isolated. And why is that important for us? Because in the end, if they don't feel committed to it, then you're not creating a culture where people feel committed in a disaster to work, that they will come back. Instead, they will think if you don't want to include them in the conversation, they will find somewhere else to work.
So what are some of those, I guess, areas that, so we've done a lot of disaster recovery, like support, in our management consulting, but it seems to be more on a project to project basis. Like, what's the recovery for this specific system versus, the overarching organization. So I'm not an expert on this by any means. So what are you, from your perspective, then, like some of those key things for us to be looking at as an organization?
The first thing I look at any disaster plan, and I've looked at thousands of them, both as an
Mm,
international consultant and both with working directly with clients, working with the public and private sector, working with nonprofits. I look at a disaster plan, and a lot of times I'll do this. I'll start to work with a big company, and they'll hand me their big disaster plan. They'll say, "Okay, Patrick, here's the plan. Go ahead and review it. Get back to us, and tell us if you can find anything wrong with it." And so
mm,
I'll sit there in the meeting in the room and I'll lay these big binders, usually plural, on the table, and I'll pick one out at random. And I will open it up and I will start to read it. And there are things that I can notice in it immediately that will tell me whether or not the plan is going to work. And this is one of the big ones. I'll tell you now, one of the biggest things I look for in any disaster plan, I don't care how well it's written, I don't care how much money is involved. I don't care whether or not you have the greatest techno whizzes of all time that you can recover all your digital systems and applications and software and hardware and everything. It all comes
mm,
down to one thing: employee empowerment. Are employees empowered in your disaster program? And when I say disaster program, let me be a little more specific.
yeah.
Really, there's in every type of company that has an effective and comprehensive disaster program, it involves three things: planning, training, and what we call drills and exercises. Okay. And within planning, we look at crisis communication planning, emergency response planning, and business continuity planning. Those are really the three major ones. So crisis communication deals with a very specific set of behaviors of how we communicate with internal stakeholders, so with our employees and with our boards of director, and then the external stakeholders, so the media, the public. So whenever you see those social media messages after the CEO absconds with $200,000 and leaves, those messages that you read about in the Wall Street Journal, or you read online somewhere, or on Yahoo or Fox News or whatever, that's where that comes from. Then you look at the emergency response plan, right? And the emergency response plan is what we call the lights and sirens phase. That's really what I like to call it, because that's the stuff we talk about: evacuations and sheltering in place and locking down, and all that stuff you see on that TV show 911, or on those shows Chicago Fire, people going out of burning buildings. That's the emergency response plan. The business continuity plan is that really technical document which tells us specifically how to recover, right? So it tells us each specific plank. But the reason why I tell you all that is because, as you can see from each element of those disaster plans, employees have to be empowered. They have to know what the expectations are in a disaster. I see this way too often, where people hire external consultants, people like myself, people who are IT
Mhm.
experts, like my father was. And we used to be asked to come into a company and say, okay, I want you to recover our information technology and prepare the planning. And he would do that and customize it. But he was always really clear that if you didn't train people on it, and by training, I don't mean I'm standing here and I'm telling you the way it's got to be. It's the trainings that I think are really effective are the ones where people are engaging you, where it is like a workshop almost, because
Mm.
management has certain responsibilities and expectations. Totally understand that. But then when you have line employees, you would be amazed at some of the insights and things they will tell you, because those clues can help instruct how to better write the plan itself. I do this all the time. I'll take a plan and I'll just have a draft. I won't finalize it. Then I'll go to a
Mm.
training, and then I'll literally, instead of telling employees, you need to do this, and when this happens, don't talk to the media and don't do these things. Instead, I say, if the media comes up to you, what do you think the expectations are? And what do you think are reasonable? And how would you handle a situation where there was a microphone put in your face, kind of like I have one now? And you'd be amazed at the answers. Not because I'm going to change the policies, but it helps me to understand what's going to be the dynamic. Because when you're in a disaster environment, you have one where there can be a leadership vacuum. And so what I tell people who write these voluminous disaster plans, these sort of elephantine plans, I always say, make sure that you are really looking at the way the behavior is of employees. I was at the BP oil spill. I was hired by one of the largest contractors of BP to write a disaster plan for all their training sites. So this ended up being 30,000 people total. And so I was a one man department, and I was going from site to site to site, and I wrote this great big disaster plan. I was very proud of it. And so I went, and they said, okay, so here's the if you want to train everybody, go ahead and make arrangements. So I did. And so I started in Alabama, because for those of you who recall, the BP oil spill occurred in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. And so the affected states were Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. And so I was working, my first site was in, I'll never forget this till the day I take my last breath. I was in South Alabama, and I was wearing a suit. See, like, actually, I'm really underdressed compared to the way I was then. I had a tie on, I had a nice thing, and everything was perfect. And I showed up on site, and I said, here's the plan. This is what we're going to do. I've written it with the big wigs, and here's what we've determined. It's going to be this, 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 and this. And the room was filled with oyster fishermen from South Alabama. You're not going to see a lot of those guys wearing suits and ties. Not a lot of those guys are going to have perfectly combed hair. Those guys were wearing just regular clothing. They were wearing overalls, things they would wear to work. And so I thundered away for 2 hours. I consider myself reasonably articulate and reasonably interesting. But at the end of it, I got complete silence. Nobody said anything. 2 hours of talking and silence. And so finally, I talked to one of the managers, and I said, "What happened? I wrote this beautiful plan. I mean, I got management approval. Unified Area Command approved this thing." And he said to me, young man, here's the problem. In South Alabama, we do things very, very differently than anywhere else. So one of the first problem, before I even talk about your plan, the first problem you have is wearing a suit. You can't
Mm.
wear a suit when you're down here because here in South Alabama, when we see guys in the suit, we think of three agencies: the
Lawyer.
FBI, the IRS, or somebody's lawyer
Mm.
who's going to sue you. So
Mm.
you need to adapt that. And so that's what I did with the continuity plan. I actually went back to Mobile and I rewrote the plan, not because I had to change my shirt or my tie, although I did. What I
Mm.
did was I said, that tells me something interesting. I haven't listened to the very people who are going to be most impacted by the plan in which I am writing. And so I really make it so now when I train, and I've trained people in the restaurant industry, I've trained beekeepers, I've done all kinds of interesting things.
Mm.
And every single time I make sure it's engaging. Now, when you're in a business continuity processing, it's the same way. And I encourage continuity planners to get into a dialogue, talk with the employees as you're developing your business impact analyses. What is going to be the true impact? Because that helps you
Mm.
to evaluate what are the continuity strategies that are going to work based on the kind of business, the kind of area, and most importantly, the culture of the people to which will be affected by the plan.
So what are some of those questions, I guess, that you ask them? I mean, I'd be curious what that dialogue kind of looks like when you're talking to the actual, I always say end users, but not
You mean
exactly
the
what
employees?
it is here, but yeah, but down to the actual employees. Yeah.
Yeah. I literally ask people this. I say, how many of you have a second job? How many
Mm.
of you live within, and I give usually a radii, and it depends on the kind of business, right? So, I mean, if you run a coffee shop and we got people who live 30 miles out, that's going to be a serious problem, right? But
Mm.
that's an important question to ask. I also ask people questions like, do you want to work remotely? And that seems like a strange question. But during the
Mm.
pandemic, in the years prior to the pandemic, people used to say, I used to read about this all the time. I used to read on LinkedIn and other articles, people saying, eventually work is going to go entirely remote. No one's going to
Mm.
ever want to come back to the office ever again. And if people don't have to go to school, people will just stay home. The world will all become coders and AI experts. And then lo and behold, we'll never need an office ever again. And so a few months go by in the pandemic. And then all of a sudden, so I started to see this paradigm shift where literally employees were demanding that employers reopen offices or make
Wow.
critical decisions about it. So one of the things that happened, for example, was that a lot of people, and I know that I'm saying this in kind of a facetious way, but it really is
Mm.
true. A lot of people love being home. They love their kids, they love their pets, they love their spouses or their significant others, but they don't want to spend all day with them every
Mm-hmm.
single day. Some
Right.
people want to go to the office. They like that separation. And some people don't
Mm.
work well from home at all. I know people who are
Yeah.
like that. I actually had employees who specifically said, we want you to reopen the office so we can come in. And that's perfectly fine. I understand that. In addition, there are some people who basically said, if I'm being required to work from home from now on, I don't want to live where I live, because if I don't have to live here, then I can live somewhere else that's more pleasant. This particularly happened in Silicon Valley, where there were employees who were told you are going to be converted into a remote employee entirely. And then some people said, then why am I living in an apartment where I'm paying 8 grand a month?
Mm-hmm.
Why am I living in a city? And it wasn't necessarily just Silicon Valley. This also happened in Miami. This happened in DC. This happened in a lot of places where people were saying, why am I living in a neighborhood that's dangerous? Because it's close proximity to work. If I'm going to work remotely, then I want to move. And those are conversations I actually tell employers. You need to inform employees about your remote work policies before
Right.
the disaster. not after, because that's something to know. And again, it's not a dictatorial element. It's something to learn from. Talk with them, ask them. I always ask people, would you like to work from home? And I literally, you'd be surprised, you get a lot of no's. A lot of people say, I don't want to do that. And I
Hmm.
actually, the other thing, which is doesn't necessarily apply a lot to Fortune 500 companies, but this applies universally to small businesses. If you work for a small business, you need to ask this following question to your employer, if they haven't asked you already. This is a really important question, and it's one I ask all small business owners I work with.
Hmm.
After a disaster, are you ever planning to recover at all? Because I know small businesses who say, I actually have a small business owner who said, if the building burns down in a wildfire, we're not reopening. I'm going to take the insurance money and I'm going to retire. And I work with a lot of outdoor hospitality properties. I work with a lot of campgrounds and I work with a lot of RV parks, places where there are subcultures I had no idea existed, and they're really there. They're incredible. And so many of the owners said this to me: if my park burns down, I'm just going to take the insurance money. I'm going to buy an RV and I'm going to be a customer for other people's parks because I don't want to run the park anymore. Or this was my parents' dream. This isn't mine. Or I'm just tired. Or I just don't want to do it anymore. Or I don't want to take the time, because I think a lot of people forget rebuilding a business is extremely hard. There's a lot of elements
Hmm.
and things you have to think about. And so one of the things I say to them is I say, make sure that the owner wants to remain in business. And does you don't even sometimes even have to ask specifically. You can kind of tell, especially if you've worked with somebody for a really long time. It becomes rather obvious whether or not they're going to want to stay in business or not. And I've had some small business owners who turned to me and said, honestly, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm done. And so if it burns down, why reopen a restaurant? It was hardly profitable anyway. I didn't really enjoy it. This was my mom and dad's thing. I want to go out and do something else. I actually had a client, this really happened. I had a client, she ran a restaurant. The restaurant burned down. And she turns to me and says, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to become a lawyer. And so she took the money
Hmm.
she got from the restaurant and paid for law school. So she became a lawyer. So a lot of people just say, and I told her, I said, that's perfectly fine. That's wonderful. It's great that you came to that revelation, but you need to tell your employees this, because if they are expecting a paycheck a month after you burn down, that puts them in a place that's very, very difficult. And whether we like to think it or not, a lot of people live hand to mouth. A lot of people live paycheck to paycheck. And so we have to be cognizant of that without saying to people, do you live paycheck to paycheck? We don't do
Right.
that, right? But we do say to them, understand that the management of this business has decided that if this place burns down, we're not going to be here anymore. And you're going to have to find a new job. That allows people immediately to find better circumstances that's best for themselves, for their families, and for their communities as a whole.
I, you may not know this, but it might be too narrow of a question, but I'm just curious, what do insurance companies think about that? I mean, I get they have to pay out, I suppose, regardless of what somebody does, but do you know whether or not they want them to go back into business or take the money and run?
Uh,
Just, I've never even thought
Political
about it.
card. No, I'm kidding. I officially they're agnostic, right? Officially they're
Hmm.
agnostic. Unofficially,
Okay.
and I can't speak for any insurance company, and I can't speak for the industry as a whole. And some people who may be
Right,
listening to
right.
this, who may be in the insurance industry, may say, Patrick, you're way off. But I think a lot of people feel as though there are areas, and again, this is not, so don't quote me as I said all of America. There are places where sometimes there may be companies that say, I'm kind of glad I no longer have to worry about this because I don't want to insure this person. I mean, not saying that
Mm.
that's a policy, but that may be
Right,
something
right.
internally that they're thinking because they think the risk is really high here, or of a wildfire, or the risk is really high of a hurricane, or more likely flooding, right? So that actually happens, particularly in areas where traditionally insurance companies have covered the area. Then all of a sudden you start to get a lot of flooding, and they say, well, if you can't get, flood insurance, you know, maybe I'm just out of it, or maybe, there's a specific threat. Um, that we don't want to cover. But I think in the end, I think insurance companies are like, they're human beings like the rest of us. I mean, people who work for insurance companies are like the rest of us. And I think that that in the end, they want people to be in a position where they have appropriately covered risk. And that's one of the things I
Mm,
talk to people about all the time is that insurance, what insurance money is, it is a way to cover losses, right?
mhm,
Business continuity offers you a way to recover your processes and your functions, things that insurance companies can't always pay for. That's stuff they can't pay for, right? And so what you have to do is do that planning. Because I think far too often business owners think, well, I've got plenty of insurance, so I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to worry about disaster planning, and they forget those policies have exceptions. There's holes in them. During the pandemic, this happened all the time. People were filing for they were reporting losses of various things, and they didn't realize that viruses were not covered. So this also happens also with cyber attacks. I have seen this very, very often. Again, I'm not trying to demonize any insurance company because I understand they're running a business like the rest of us. But there are
mm.
times where they said, if you didn't have a specific policy which covered the specific provisions of a cyber attack, then we're not going to pay out. We're going to disclaim. And so that is the thing that I try to prevent business owners from understanding. Because I don't want, because then what happens is that you get a miscommunication because the business owner thinks I'm covered. The insurance company thinks he understands he's not covered because nobody reads that, 8-point font. I mean, I don't know. I either actually end up having a person explain it to me before I would buy insurance policies for my business because I need to understand them. But that's one of the things, as I always say, is make sure you are absolutely understanding what the policy is going to cover. And that prevents the miscommunications from occurring. And it makes it a lot easier. So, and that makes it so that you and the insurance company live a really have sort of harmonious relationship. But if you do not incorporate them and really try to understand what their place is, then what ends up happening is you get this really weird incongruent situation where the insurance company says we're going to provide X and the business says I thought it was X, Y, and Z.
What areas do you find are the most commonly overlooked? So you mentioned communication plans to employees. I don't know if that's a common one, but what are those things that a lot of companies just go, oh, I never thought about that?
You mean as far as threats go, or on the plan or planning?
The plan. I mean the threat would be interesting as well, but yeah, I meant the plan.
I could tell you some stories. Yeah, as far as planning goes, one of the most interesting and overlooked portions of the plan is when you look at. I'm going to move now from continuity for a minute because
Mm,
I will tell you there's a lot of technical elements regarding continuity that people forget. Because one really quick example I can give for continuity wise is when people say, "Okay, you're going to work from home," and people say, "Sounds good." And then I've had companies before where they had cloud security that was so strict that if your IP address went through a different VPN or came from somewhere else, it literally blocked you from getting into the cloud because it assumed
mm,
that all the computers and all the logins would occur within a single geographic space, and outside of that geofenced area, that it will block it, and literally people couldn't get into the cloud. In
mm.
emergency response, I will tell you the biggest thing that people forget, and they forget it all the time, is who's in charge? Who's in charge? This happens all the time. I challenge this, and because the obvious answer is always this. I love doing this with audiences. I do this all the time. I go in front of businesses. That's why I love getting hired by these companies. So I'll go out and I'll say, okay, everybody, be a big room, be filled with 100 people in there. I'll say, okay, guys, if we have a disaster, who's in charge? And universally, there's sort of like a one beat where everyone's just kind of doing this, and then everyone turns and says, CEO Susie Q, or CEO John Doe, or manager so and so, or the business owner. And so I always say, okay, imagine they just got married and they are currently in Barbados and they don't know what's going on. Next. And then they always say, oh, President so and so, Melissa so and so, or John so and so. Well, Melissa and John are on jury duty. Next. And I literally start filing it down until finally employees realize it might be them. And so when
Mm,
I talk to people, I say this to management all the time. I say, please don't assume you're going to be there during a disaster. And because I understand you want to make all the executive decisions. I totally get. I was a CEO myself 15 years. I totally get it. But in the end, there are going to be instances where you are incapacitated or injured. I could give without even picking up my phone, without looking at a piece of paper, I could write down 6 examples, real examples of real businesses where people were unable to respond for one reason or another, either because
mm,
the disaster was large or there was a large communication infrastructure failure. I mean, imagine we just had the bridge collapse at the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Maryland, which is an awful, awful disaster. And one of the things that people have to realize is what if your boss was on one side of the bridge, your business is on
mm,
the other side of the bridge, and now you have to make decisions because one employee was a casualty or somebody was injured. What do you
right.
do then? Who's in charge? And so I challenge Fortune 500 companies too, and larger businesses. They don't have to be Fortune 500 businesses, but larger businesses. And I say, listen, you know, you can give employees, baseline employees, a simple set of activities and behaviors that they can perform. They'll feel involved. And by being involved, they will be able to act as the responders. Otherwise, they're just standing around like lemmings. They got nothing to do, and that's just a
Mm,
waste. And so I'd say to people, don't waste all these wonderful resources, these wonderful people who have a lot of institutional knowledge. They are very loyal to you and they will assist. But if you marginalize them, then that resource is wasted and it's as if they were never there at all. So one of the things I say in every disaster plan is make sure that you devolve responsibility up and down the line so that people at various levels can take responsibility. The person who are at the lowest employees, I mean, they don't have to take over the company, but I mean, there are things they can do. They can activate 911. They can, activate the crisis communication plan. They can do that. And there are things that they can do. Again, they're not going to hold a major press conference, with CNN, but there are things that they can say to the press, which helps to give them the understanding of we understand that the business owner or the responsible manager isn't here yet, but when they get here, there are certain things that they can do because if you don't, what happens is again, you have a series of employees who are completely marginalized out of the process, and that means they are not bought in to what you want them to do in your plan.
It's interesting. You mentioned empowerment, and I was just thinking a little more on that. I worked for a big box retailer, and they actually, they had a lot of the disaster recovery things. Like, if this happens, this is what you should do, at each of the store level.
Oh, good.
Um, but the thing that, like, so I was working one day and there was a tornado, and like, you know what to do if there's a threat. Like they say, you move everybody to the back of the store. You I can't remember all the steps, but there were clear steps on what you could do. But it was very scary. Like, all the leaders in our store building are in their 20s to make that decision for a significant, like, the significant revenue, right, coming in the store. We're not talking about a little store, big box. um,
Right. Right.
and
Exactly.
to be like, will I get in trouble if I tell all the customers to go to the back of the store while this tornado is going on? But what happens if, like, I don't do it and something happens? So I guess, in that empowerment, I think there's a level of people have to make a judgment call. And so then you can't hold them
Yes.
accountable if they make the wrong judgment call, because you've now empowered them to make that judgment call. And you got to, I mean, not to say you can't give feedback, right? But people can't be afraid, right? Have that lingering in the back of their mind.
I love that example. That is absolutely that paralysis, that management
Mm,
paralysis is exactly what I try to avoid. That's exactly why
mm,
we ask those quiet questions because you have 20-year-old or 25-year-old, 26-year-old people. So people who are pretty new to the corporate world. Maybe they worked in the store before. Maybe they were a college kid that went to a management program. I've seen that before, where they were they'd
Right.
never even been in some of
Yep.
these stores, but they were sort of
Yep.
hired guns. I've seen people who had 26-year-old MBAs come out, and nothing against
Yep.
MBAs. They're great. I hired a few in
No.
my lifetime myself, but they come out and they literally they're not used to trying to make these decisions. And
Hmm.
what business continuity plans do, for those of you who are responsible for one or those of you who are involved in them, is that's the tool. What Jen just talked about, that's exactly what that tool is meant to avoid. Is it gives people,
Mm.
when it says, I am authorized to move the computers to the back because I have to make a judgment call where this is not a basic tornado watch here. We're at a tornado warning, which means we're talking about immediate touchdown here. Or maybe we decide we don't have the time. We have to immediately
Right.
shelter in
Right.
place in whatever location it was in the store and get people prepared for a potential touchdown. Right. So that's one of the things that the continuity plan does. And the problem is that so many companies will literally say this, and this may surprise you. A lot of companies say, I don't want them making that decision at all. I don't want them even
Mm.
thinking about it. They need to call a regional manager. This happens at restaurants too, all the time. Chains who will say, you need to call the regional. The regional will make the decisions. Go when the tornado hits the building or before.
Right. Right.
These are decisions that have to be made
Yeah.
instantaneously. So what they act as the continuity and the emergency response plan do, they act as a series of policies which say management allows us to do these things, but this other narrow band of activities require a regional. But even then,
Yeah.
if it's a life safety issue, I don't think the regional manager is going to care if I do X, Y, and Z, because if it saves people and protects people, and if that company is well managed, then they will say you did the right thing. But again, without the
Yep.
planning, the paralysis that you saw
Oh.
increases into chaos. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
And that's it. Well, I was gonna say that's where we landed on. So it actually happened a couple of times that season
Wow.
where we actually had to move everybody to the back, but and definitely felt more confident after the first time, right? But exactly to what you're saying, never had to make those decisions, had the book, right? Knew what to do, but it's
Right.
and it was a warning, but it was like, but is it like we don't see the tornado? So what does that mean? Yeah.
Right.
So anyway, um, how far, like, when does my judgment supposed to kick in? Anyway, so I was very glad that they had got through all of that to that point. Probably would have been good though, is what you were talking about at the beginning, is workshops and role playing, right? And getting to be in those situations. And that company actually did that really well in other areas, because I was a part of a lot of de-escalation, like role playing. And how do
Okay. How
you
did you deal with an
like,
unruly
so
customer, that kind of thing?
right, getting aggressive, violent, like in those pieces. So
Huh?
they did a lot of that, but we never did it with the disaster recovery, which would have been an interesting next step.
Yeah, and that's one
um
of the things I say. And the other thing that I like to say to companies too is I say, look, it doesn't require days and days of work. There are literally, I can do some of these things in an hour and a half to 2 hours, and I can take whole employees and say, this is how we do it. If I can distill the plan down to certain things, I can get certain policies created and promulgated, because the plan doesn't say it. There's no point to training people on it. If it doesn't say it,
hmm,
there's no point doing it. But if you do develop those, you can quickly train people to do exactly what you said, which is say, I'm empowered to make judgment calls. I'm empowered to
hmm,
do certain things that traditionally I wouldn't do in the store. And that helps to ensure that everybody has a hand in it, versus there being some kind of omniscient being that says through the pages, hey, don't do this, don't do that. That
right.
isn't what develops into a good culture of preparedness. So
Mm.
but that's definitely an interesting point, because that does happen a lot more often than I think than people think.
Well, Patrick, the time's flown by. I think I'm going to have to ask you what three things you want to leave top of mind for folks.
Yes, absolutely. And I've had a lot of fun. And before we end, I want to say thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed talking with
Okay.
you, and I hope everyone who is hearing this, I hope you really enjoyed it. That's really the point. The three things I want to leave you with are these. First of all, disaster preparedness does not have to be doom and gloom. It doesn't have
Mm.
to be blood and guts. It doesn't have to be Chicken Little. It doesn't have to be that. It can be empowering. It can make you stronger. That is what I'm an avatar for. Is I advocate for people to look at disaster planning and say, this is going to make me stronger after the disaster. So, and in doing that, it turns it from this insurmountable thing into something that is an obstacle that is going to make me better in the long run. And the second thing is, I'm going to reinforce the message that we were talking about earlier, and I think it's really important, is whenever you are doing a disaster program, whether it's for yourself, for your family, for your pets, for your business, whatever, ensure that what you are doing is empowering the people around you. That is not putting people in a position that they can't do it. In 2 weeks, I'm going to be creating a video. We're going to put it on YouTube. I'm going to evacuate 400 cats from an animal shelter in Northern California. And we all know this thing about herding cats. Well, I got to herd them all right. And I have some first responders who are going to be very, very surprised when they discover the tasks that I have set out for themselves and for me, because it's a great challenge. But it's not that I have to
Mm,
empower the cats. I mean, but I want to empower myself so that I can facilitate it so that the animals are best prepared and they are safe when we are evacuating them. The third thing is,
mm,
what makes the disaster worse has nothing to do with the size of it. What makes a disaster worse has nothing to do with its place on the, whether it's a category 5 hurricane or whether it's an EF4 tornado. That's not what makes the disaster worse. What makes disasters worse is how dependent are you on other institutions to do things for you. Don't let them do things for you, because one of the things that we were just talking about was about insurance companies. All the time I hear small businesses say, listen, if I have a disaster, no problem. The insurance company will take care of it. And I say, do you want to go on Google? Should we Google this? Should we talk about whether or not there might be a misunderstanding as to what insurance is for or what may be in your own
mm,
policy? I also have people who don't plan because they say the government will take care of it or my business will take care of it. And I say, really? Have you ever asked them? That's really the main thing. So what I tell people is it's okay to rely on other people and other institutions. That's fine. But you need to have backups. I always say go 3 deep with everything, because then you're never dependent on one institution or one person to make something happen. You have enough diversity that you develop what we call true resilience. So you are in a position where the disaster doesn't cut you down. It actually builds you up. It puts you in a position to be stronger afterward, not weaker. And that's the metric I always use with everybody. Whether I work with high net worth families, I work with very wealthy families, I work with nonprofits where they work with people who live in cars in parking lots. I've worked with small businesses and big companies. I say, no matter what, I know that the disaster preparedness job I have done for you is effective if after the disaster is over, after we've had time to grieve and think about whatever's happened, am I making you stronger in the end? Because if you're not
mm.
stronger afterwards, everything you learned, everything you experienced, everything that happened to you is completely wasted. And that, I think, is the true tragedy and the true disaster. So thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it. And I hope that those 3 things are helpful for everybody who is hearing this today.
Absolutely. And Patrick, where can folks find out more about what you do or get in contact with you?
I am at disasterpatrick.com. Up there, I have things for those of you who are looking for a keynoter. As you can tell, I'm a very dramatic guy. I love disaster preparedness. Also, if you want to hire me as a consultant, and also we have a YouTube page that's coming up very soon. It's going to be populated with lots of videos. And again, we're not talking about the blood and guts videos. These are videos that you're going to laugh at. You're going to laugh at me. I give you complete permission to do that and to look at disaster planning differently. I want you to see that it can make you stronger and better. And that's the entire purpose. And that's what I'm hoping to do. And so go on there, contact me, email me, call me. I would love to speak with you and love to see how I can help you on your disaster preparedness journey.
Excellent. Patrick, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. And to our audience, until next time, keep your organizations healthy.